we'll start with an introductory question, just so that the students can get to know who you are a little bit better. Could you please tell us about your career journey and what it is you do now?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. So I always wanted to be a musician, basically, and I grew up in Wales, in Cardiff, in the 1980s. Went to school in Cardiff, rather comprehensive school, and to be honest, I was like pretty fixated on wanting to be a drummer. So from a really early age, I had pots and pans around the house and wooden spoons, anything that would make a good sound. And I just got really into playing the drums, got a drum kit, started to put together bands with my friends, started when I got to be a teenager doing gigs. And I was just really loving it, not just musically, but just socially as well. And at that point, I thought I'd love this to be a job, and just worked and worked and worked so that it became a job for me. And ever since then, music's the common thread. I don't really play now, but what I've done over the last really sort of, well, 25 years is worked in music charities. So initially in charities that are working at the grassroots, delivering workshops and projects with young people, mainly in the southwest of England. And for the last 10 years, since 2012, I've had the privilege of being the CEO of Youth Music, which is a pretty large young people in music's charity that works across the UK. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a sec. So yeah, that's the kind of journey. So drums, music, how it made me feel good, really, and continues to make me feel good. And then realizing that you can kind of make a living out of it, you know, and there's various ways that you can look at that, which I'm sure we'll talk about today.
I'm sure we will. Thank you for that introduction. Great to know that you grew up in Wales.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have anyone from Wales on the call, but I feel like it's not so often that we hear speakers say that they grew up in Wales, and I imagine that was a great place to be drawing with your friends and a great social thing to do.
Yeah, it was. It was a village called Rada, which is just outside Cardiff, and yeah, happy times really. A good primary school, a good secondary school. And you know, there was music in the secondary school, but I suppose even more so, I was finding time and opportunities to make music outside school, and that was really important to me. But yeah, you know, good times.
So, our next question is thinking about you in your youth when you were at school, like many of these young people on the call. What was your dream job as a teenager, and did you ever think that you would end up as a CEO?
That's a really good question. I think my dream job went in sort of steps and different phases. And the first step was the dream was to be a drummer. And there's a theatre in Cardiff called the New Theatre, which I think still exists. It's a kind of pretty classic Victorian looking theatre, and it used to put on gigs. And 1980, I was 12. I got to see Buddy Rich, who was and probably still is regarded as the world's greatest drummer. And he had this big band, and they came over from the States and they played this gig. And I went with my friend, and I just like was knocked out by it, absolutely knocked out, and thought, that's my dream job. I want to be a drummer. And I was learning a bit at the time. And that stayed with me right the way through school, about loving playing the drums and then just starting to think with the help of others how to make a living from it. And I think looking back, the difference that making music gives you as a young person, just in terms of confidence and self-belief and working with others in bands, it's so much fun, obviously, but it really helps develop you as a person. And then actually, I didn't think I'd be a CEO then, you know, that was phase one, but that difference that music makes socially and personally has stayed with me ever since. And now I'm a CEO in a charity, that's absolutely focused on that. So I guess it all makes sense. But I didn't know then that I was going to be a CEO. I didn't really know what a CEO was, you know. But as you develop and as you learn, I realized that you can run organizations, you know, you can run charities, you can run music businesses. And then that's what I've been doing at Youth Music since 2012.
Yeah, I guess as a teenager, you never think, oh, that's what I'm going to do. But it's crazy to see that this is where you've ended up and you're still doing what you love. You know, what made you, what was the point where you decided that you didn't want to just be a drummer, and you wanted to go into the charity sector, and help support others? What was that turning point when you came to that realization?
Yeah, it was as I was making my career as a drummer, I was starting to be employed to work in places where music and hopefully my work could make a real difference. So that was in places like special schools, pupil referral units, prisons, mental health units, anywhere that that kind of power of music could make a real social difference for young people. And I guess that was like a second moment that that was really powerful work, and hopefully it went well for everybody involved. And I think that was a shift where I suddenly realized I did love playing the drums and I did love going around in my van with my kit and working for people. But I got even more of a buzz about working with others on how music and taking part and making music can make a real difference in people's lives, particularly those who maybe face quite significant barriers in their lives through no fault of their own. And that sort of social power of music was a real sort of light bulb moment that then took me away from just playing drums in gigs to then actually using music and percussion in these community settings and then running organizations. So again, the theme has stayed the same, but my role in making it all happen has really changed.
And just as a as an extended question, I hope you don't mind. What sort of thing did you do when you went into these, you know, pupil referral units and prisons and things like that? What did you do with the other people that were in those to kind of help, lift them up and build that connection?
Yeah, I was on a scheme called Live Music Now, which is worth checking out, everybody. It's a scheme that by audition, if you get on the scheme, you're given lots of paid work as a young professional, but in really interesting and sometimes quite challenging situations and places. So if I was employed by Live Music Now to say work in a prison, I might be what was called be the musician in residence. So I'd be there for a week or 2 weeks. I'd go in every day, high security with my van, getting all my percussion instruments checked out by security. And once I got into the prison, inmates, they had some choices where they could choose to take part in certain projects. And, you know, perhaps obviously lots of them love music. So they would choose to take part in this project with me. And what we would do, we would form a band. I would help direct that band. And usually we were all writing songs together. And actually, the challenging bit was we were writing songs about the inmates' childhood experiences. And this was sponsored by the NSPCC. It was called the Full Stop campaign. So we would write songs, write lyrics, and then working together, write the music to go with those lyrics. And at the end of the project, we'd put it onto what was then CDs, and do a gig in, you know, the prison chapel. Generally, prisons have a chapel, and it's sometimes quite an austere old chapel, sometimes a new one. But we would end the project doing a big gig where all the other inmates would come, the prison officers would come. If it was allowed, some families and guests could come and we would perform the songs. So that was the prison example, and similar examples if that was in a school or a special school or in mental health, where you're using music as a sort of driver to talk about other things. And, you know, as you can probably all imagine, that was pretty powerful. And I had to be pretty, well, I had to be hopefully very musical, but hopefully also very sort of empathetic and supportive in bringing out the best of people in a hothouse of a prison atmosphere, which could sometimes get quite tense.
That must have been really amazing when you worked on this project and then got to perform in front of everyone, all that work and all the hard work and allowing them to kind of express themselves. I imagine that was really great.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. I think, and interestingly, it was like just making it clear to the inmates that I was simply there as a musician. I wasn't there because I was some kind of person to say, I'm going to make you feel better, if you know what I mean. Because, prisons get a lot of visitors who say that. But I was simply there because actually for those 2 weeks, I was working in that prison. The next 2 weeks, I could be doing something else. And that really helped that let's write some songs together. Let's write some lyrics. So I think I learned a lot about the best approach to take to get the best out of young people and inmates.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm glad I followed up with that question because I think that's a really like an interesting piece of work that when you think of, oh, what could I do to earn money from music? That's not the first thing that comes to mind. So thank you for going into a little bit more detail about that.
Sure.
Our next question leads on to, youth music.
Yeah.
And what is it exactly that the charity does? And you've probably touched on this. Why are you so passionate about what your charity does?
Okay, so youth music will be 25 years old next year. And what we say we're there to do is to equalise young people's access to music. And that's making music, learning in music, and earning in music. And we recognise that for many young people, that's harder because of the situations they face in their lives, who they are, where they're from, what they're going through. So it's this thing about equalising access, inclusion, diversity, things like that. How we achieve that goal, we largely do that by giving out money. So we give out investment to about 500 grassroots projects across the UK who are working with young people every week making music. And we give out grants, we give out about £11 million a year, and people apply to us. As well as that, we give organisations a lot of advice and guidance about how to do the best work and how to get the best out of the people that you're working with. So there's the money, but there's also our investment in terms of time and guidance. And then the last bit of that, the more money we raise, the more money we can give out. So yeah, we give out that sort of £11 million, and a lot of that is from the National Lottery, which people would have heard about. You've also probably seen the People's Postcode Lottery that are really lively on telly in terms of advertising their work, and also music industry donors. We've had some quite cool investment from TikTok, YouTube, Dr. Martens, some quite cool brands, Levi's, etc., etc. So we also have to work hard, like any charity, to raise money, and then as much as that money as possible goes out to support the frontline organisations.
Yeah, thank you again for kind of going into a little bit more detail. Again, a follow-up, because I know that someone out there might be wondering this. Is there a way that any of the young people watching can get involved, whether that's they have a project they want to work on or any sort of volunteering or anything like that? Is there anything that they can be doing or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to say would be to look at our website, youthmusic.org.uk, and there's a map in the funding section which tells you all the projects we support, and you can zoom in on the map and find out. So if you're in Wiltshire, if you're in Bristol, wherever you might be, you can zone in on where we're supporting work, and those organisations would probably be really love to hear from you. And you can get in touch and find out what they're doing, and their places, they're often like youth centres or community recording studios where you could go and help develop your work and play music. That's the first thing. I guess as people are thinking about next steps, we're doing a lot of work with 18 to 25-year-olds, which we call the Youth Music Next Gen community. And that community, again, information on the website, but we employ young people to help us backstage with events, to compare at events. We pay the proper real living wage, and we also help publicise their work. And we have something called the Next Gen Fund, which we've developed over the last few years, where we give money advice directly to young people. I guess in terms of this call, that might be a few years down the road for some of you, because we're looking at 18 to 25. So I think in the meantime, look at the map and see where we're doing work that'll be working with people of your ages. And then also, if you're thinking of the future, you know, fingers crossed, youth music will still be here and will be thriving, and we're there to help.
You've lasted 25 years already. I'm sure you definitely will be.
Yeah, I hope so. No, it's looking good. It's looking good, Charlie. It's like, yeah, you know, as we all know, it's tough times. It's challenging times for all sorts of reasons. But I think we've got really clear on what youth music is there to do. And as a result, hopefully, you know, people who want to give us money get inspired and they want to join us in that kind of campaign, really.
Yeah, people are always going to be passionate about music. Since the dawn of time, I think people have
Exactly.
loved to bang on things and make sounds together. So it's not something that's going to ever die out, I don't think.
Exactly.
So many young people have a dream to set up a band and get their music out there, whether that's, you know, blow up and become famous or just be a small town band. Their goal is to follow their passion of music, but they don't always know where they're going to end up because it can be quite a unpredictable industry.
Yeah.
For these young people out there, do they need to have a plan? Is it important that they are thinking about where they're going next? And is it important for them to have something like a formal education in terms of a degree, or is that not necessary?
Yeah. Some really good questions there. So I think in terms of, do you need a plan? I think you probably do, but maybe split it into phases. You know, I was saying at the start, step one, loved being a drummer. And actually, step one, wanting to be a drummer, to be honest, Charlie, it wasn't really about being famous. And actually, I think sometimes that message from reality shows and sometimes from the music industry and sometimes from education, university courses presents that as, you know, the fame thing. I would suggest maybe that should be at the back of your mind to start with. And the first step would be okay, what is it that I'm really good at? You know, what is it I'd like to pursue? And that might be playing the drums. It might be great at working a mixing desk. It might be great at, you know, backstage, helping bands set up on stage. It might be really good at writing blogs. It might be really good at like publicizing your friend's band or even being the manager of that band. So I suppose whatever it is, have a small realistic plan to start with, set yourself a bit of a timeline, and then, you know, with your friends and with your teachers, review that and tell people you've got a bit of a plan, because I think that kind of, in a way, holds yourself to account. And you'll be really nicely surprised how people want to help. But you need to tell them what that goal is. So I think, you know, there's, again, the dream of being famous, of course, I'm not saying don't have that. But as you said, it's a very, very unpredictable industry. And the people that tend to do well will often have started quite small and realistic. If you think of that kind of longer term goal of fame, that can sometimes be a bit of a distraction. So that's definitely something about that in terms of planning. In terms of where you can go to do that, the ideal scenario is you have a great music teacher in school, music's part of your school life, and that's music that you love. It's across all different styles of music. So it's a great place to be hopefully making music at lunchtime, forming a band that you can, rehearse after school. So I think that's really important. Plus also develop your life as a musician outside school. So don't just rely on formal music education. And, as your teachers and as we can all hear, education is under quite a lot of pressure at the moment, and particularly music and art subjects. So, a lot of teachers are still smashing that, getting through that and having great music departments. So make the most of that place. I used to love just like the band joining at lunchtime in a room somewhere just to make a noise for a couple of hours. A school is an ideal place for that with the guidance of your teacher. In terms of the degree bit, just the last bit, um, I did music. I went to what was then called Leicester Polytechnic. It was a performing arts degree. It's now De Montfort University in Leicester. And the thing I loved about that degree, it was absolutely right for me because it was very, very practical. It was very, very much about performing, doing things hands-on. And I guess it was less academic because that wouldn't have suited me. So I guess the choice of where you think you'd like to go is really important for music, and sussing out those courses first are really important. I don't think it's 100% necessary to have a degree to make a career in music. In fact, there's lots of evidence that says that lots of young people are kind of doing this for themselves. It's become this kind of DIY thing. Where young people are creating what we call a portfolio career, doing some gigging, maybe doing a bit of marketing, maybe working at a venue, helping backstage. So you develop lots of small things and they all begin to grow. A degree can definitely help, but I think it's about choosing the right place, and not just relying on the degree to help you make a career, if you see what I mean. You've got to sort of think of it in the round. So there's quite a few answers there. I hope that was the kind of thing you're looking for.
Yeah, it was, and I've had a couple of questions that touch that in that have been submitted to us, so we'll come back to kind of this section a little bit later. But our
Okay.
next question is thinking about, you know, in the music career, you can get a lot of rejection,
Yeah.
and you might not got a lot of yeses. You might have to deal with people not liking your music because it's not to their taste, and people's opinions coming in. So, as a musician, how do you learn to accept and welcome criticism? And then also, where do you go, okay, well, that person just, I need to let that go. How do you reach that point?
Yeah. So I think for all of us, the ability to take feedback and welcome feedback is really important in whatever thing you're pursuing and whatever thing you're doing. And generally, I found, and I think this is still the case, that people are here to help, teachers, youth leaders, musicians want to help. Um, but that comes with also probably be giving a bit of advice and maybe, slightly challenging you about thinking about an idea you have in a different way. And I think to embrace that is absolutely vital. Make the most of that because people want to help and they'll be telling you stuff that you perhaps haven't thought of. I had a percussion teacher who not only taught me how to play percussion, but literally we'd go for a cup of tea on a piece of paper. He'd say, right, this is what you need to think about if you're going to make your living. You need to find those great people. Um, a word of caution, though, as well, sometimes feedback can be delivered by somebody in a really horrible way, and actually in an unpleasant way that doesn't help anybody. And they might be doing that sometimes because of their own issues or their own ego, and they want to be all powerful. So I'd be very, very aware of that. And if it comes across like that and it's in any way like really shouting you down, um, I chose to ignore that when that happened to me, and I was right to do so. And in the worst case scenario, tell somebody. as well. Tell somebody that you've had this negative experience, because that's not good enough. And if anything, there are aspects of the music industry, and we've probably all read about it, where artists and people in industry are treated badly. So I would say overwhelmingly, most people really want to help in a positive, supportive way. But don't be afraid, if it's not done in that positive, supportive way, to reject it. And as I said, you know, if you need to, tell somebody if something like that happened.
I think that's a great bit of advice to think about, because it's not always easy as we kind of go through life, but I guess it's a learning. As the more it happens, the more you'll get better at handling it. But thank you.
Yeah, not at all.
Our final question for our formal interview before we move on to the student Q&A is, it can either be a really easy or a really difficult question depending on the speaker. So this question for you is, what piece of advice did you wish you had learned sooner?
That's a great question. I think reflecting back, I'd have loved to have learned sooner what the possibilities are to make some kind of living in music. I had to find quite a lot of that out until I got to Leicester Polytechnic. So I guess, you know, in terms of careers advice or talking with your teachers, that actually to get that advice early about the music industry in its entirety, you know, not just the fame bit, but the possibilities that are available to make some kind of living. I think there's a need for that clearly now, because sometimes it's all a bit, there's a lot of mystique. There's a lot of sort of cloudy mystique about how the industry works, and there's lots of long-term like partnerships and relationships, and it can be quite a closed shop. So actually, in a nutshell, if I'd been told earlier about the possibilities, I think that would have helped me, even though I was able to do it. Because actually, the worst thing that can happen is that, you know, you say you want a career in music, and, you know, I still hear of examples when people say, and what's going to be your proper job? And in a way that immediately can dismiss the possibilities that the music industry and music education provides in terms of employment. And for the economy, it's a massive part of the UK economy. So I think to have heard earlier than Leicester Polytechnic from people who understood that would have been really, really helpful, and I think would be really helpful for young people now.
I think that's a cracking bit of advice. So if you do have a passion for music, go out there, research, and start thinking about long-term job roles and careers that will provide for you while giving you what you enjoy, which is the ability to play music.
Exactly.
So we'll now move on to our student Q&A, and we have some questions that have been submitted to us. So we'll kind of go through these now and ask them before we end today's session. So we'll start with what we were thinking of earlier. So Saffron Walden County High School have asked, what courses would you recommend to someone who's wanting to get into a career like yours in music?
Okay. Yeah, I think first of all, have a think about what it is you're best at, and then what would probably be the best fit. So that's having a good old search, a good old look, looking at the various courses available. So, for example, if you're a developing musician on the violin and you're really into classical music, or the cello or the clarinet or the flute or anything like that, and you're really, really committed to that kind of developing a career in classical music, then there is an infrastructure of universities that are really good at that bit. And there's also the conservatoires, you know, by audition, Royal Academy, Royal College, Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama, Royal Scottish, Royal Northern, these places that are kind of for those type of musicians. And I guess they're the ones that are really committed to wanting to perform pretty much as a musician. So that would be one aspect. If you were thinking of secondly, like the more kind of commercial music industry, so that might be because you're a great guitarist, you're a great bass player, you'd like to be a session player working for others, or you're developing a band. There's organizations like ACM, they're really good to take a look at. BIM, both established organizations, and also an organization called DBS. So you can search for all these things, and they've got centres around the UK where you can do vocational courses and degrees that's very industry focused. So that's a different type of experience. And I guess the third bit is the university that maybe puts on a course that's around community music, or the more sort of social policy side of music, arts and culture policy. If you're thinking of being like an administrator or a manager, maybe choosing a course a bit like that that talks to you more about, and you learn more about cultural policy and administration. And, you know, perhaps you want to work in higher education yourself and be a lecturer. So you'd probably take a more academic route. So I suppose the short way of saying that is work out what is it that you want to do, and then have high expectations about where you'd like to go and do some good search. And just maybe be a little bit aware of the courses. And perhaps this happens in any subject, but there's still quite a lot of courses knocking around and saying, do you want to work in the music industry? Come here. And it's sort of this marketing push. But you need to get deeper, you know, who are the lecturers? Who are the teachers? Are they in the music industry, or were they in the music industry 30 years ago? Do you know what I mean? You're looking for kind of current people who you could learn a lot from. So a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it's really important in terms of the choices you make, Charlie.
I think that is an interesting answer, and I think that idea of researching who is teaching you is quite important when it comes to music, and it might not in other subjects, and it's not something that you think about straight away when you're applying for a course, reading the syllabus or whatever. So that's a really little top tip that you spouted there, that I think could be quite helpful.
Yeah, you know, who are these people? Do you know what I mean? Who are these people? Check them out. You know, what have they done? Because that environment that you're learning from people is like massively important. And as I said before, you know, if you look at the Youth Music Map, there'll be the organisations in your locality that we fund that would also be able to tell you about stuff locally if you weren't necessarily thinking about going miles away from home. Because that's the other option. I did have that moment where I was like, should I stay in Cardiff, gigging in bands, you know, playing in all the pubs and clubs, and I was loving it. But there was also that realization that there was an opportunity here to sort of broaden and get out of Cardiff and go to Leicester. And again, you know, it was a top tip of advice at the time. It was like, yeah, I think it was actually my parents who was like, perhaps you should get beyond Cardiff. And they were right. So that's the other thing to think about, just personally, where do you want to be?
For sure. So our next question comes from Grey Court School, and they've asked several, but the first one that we'll go for is, what struggles or issues did you face during your music career, and how did you overcome them?
Oh, these are great questions. Okay, two things. The first thing was, and we've touched on it really, in that kind of 16 to 18 sort of age. So, you know, playing in bands, loving it. But I had a percussion teacher in Cardiff, and I got like a scholarship type thing to have these lessons. And that was really hard because, and I'll be honest here, the teacher was really horrible. And, you know, I talked earlier about taking advice, but he decided to be very, very like hierarchical and aggressive in his stance. And that really knocked my confidence. In hindsight, I probably should have said more to other people that this isn't acceptable, but, you know, maybe you don't want to do that. And I didn't. And that was quite negative because my goal about being a musician, he made me feel it wasn't possible. And it's not about not taking feedback, but it was quite destructive feedback. So I got to Leicester Poly and I had this amazing environment, confidence quite low, and it really picked up. So I think that was the first thing. I think the second thing was, and in the scheme of things, this wasn't perhaps as significant, but when I've started to say to people, you know, I want to be a CEO, or I was applying for jobs that wasn't about being a drummer, what I found, and I don't know whether other people find this, you can sometimes be stereotyped. So it's like, oh no, Matt, you're a drummer, so you know, how could you possibly want to be a CEO? You know, and not only that, could a drummer in any way be a CEO? So I suppose there was perceptions and stereotypes, and people want to put you in a box to say you're this, or your target is this, or you're this. And actually, we're all lots of different things. So I suppose just having the sort of self-belief that, no, I do want to be a CEO and I'll make the case and I'll probably have to work quite hard at it. And I've made the case and I became a CEO. So the first one was probably really hard. The second one was just a bit of a journey. You know, you talked about that career journey. How do you properly market yourself, but with real authenticity, so people can really see the real you?
And I think that's perfect to kind of for our next question, which is came in anonymously, which is, should musicians have a backup plan and what should it be? And I think that kind of is a really nice place to ask that question, thinking of that kind of what people say and think.
Yeah, and the backup plan is set yourself a bit of a timeline, you know, set yourself 3 years and then review it regularly and then review after 3 years to see how it's gone and have you got to where you want to be. But also what we're seeing, particularly with the next gen and young creatives across the UK, and I find this really exciting, they're DIY and they're working out a way to make a living, which might be doing some gigs, but it also might be, you know, working in an office to earn a bit of money or working in a restaurant to earn a bit of money. So I guess there's that acceptance that it's likely you'll have to do a bit of that. So I was doing gigs, I was doing workshops, I was doing a bit of writing, I was doing a bit of composing. So all those different components helped establish the career. Interestingly, I didn't really have the backup plan that said, okay, if this doesn't work, you know, I'm going to do something completely different. So I suppose what I'm saying is I had a sort of good sense of keep to your mission, you know, have a bit of self-confidence. It's not arrogance, but have a bit of self-confidence to say, no, this is what I want to do. So be a bit driven about that. And maybe after 3 years, if it's not moved at all, then you can go, okay, I need to have a rethink. But don't start with the idea that you have to have a backup plan. Give it your best shot in the first place.
Great. I think we have time just for a couple more questions. So the next question that we'll go for comes from Devi's. Again, I probably said that wrong. I know we said it pronounced it earlier, but it's definitely a difficult pronunciation. School sixth form. Devises. That's one. And they've asked a 3-part question. So how to find connections?
Yeah.
How to create a band, and how to become noticed in a small area like Devizes.
Okay. Yeah, no Devizes, no Wiltshire. Yeah, all good. Let's have a think. So I think the first thing to do in terms of exploring connections, was that the first bit? Yeah?
Yeah, so how do they find connections?
Yeah, okay. I think there's two bits of that because I'm automatically assuming that there might be connections in school. And your teachers will also have those connections, particularly if they're involved in music or they're music teachers. So I think make the most of those connections. I love making connections and I love people helping me to make connections. Um, it's the classic in the music department, put a notice on the board, you want to form a band. This is when you're going to first meet. This is what you're looking like. This is what you want it to sound like. Maybe give a little flavour of what your vision is for that band. And very quickly, I think you'll find people will gather around. So I think there's definitely something about that. I would also say look up on the website, look up on the map and make connections with those community organisations outside school that we're supporting. In some ways, they're an even more flexible environment where you can go and rehearse, and it's not perhaps as so rigid to the school day. So I think as a musician, that can really help. So I think it's also exploring like local community connections. I've talked about the organisations that are doing degrees. Look at youth music, obviously. There's a great website run by an organisation called UK Music. And UK Music really is the representative body for the music industry. And I'd definitely take a look at that in terms of the kind of national picture. Um, Forming a band is a great way to do it. That was like, I love doing that. And as I said, I think one of you will probably have to be the sort of leader, if you like. So forming a band, I tended to be the one getting everybody together. The first band was called the Super Hot Dogs, and that was my job. And again, one of you will probably have to take responsibility. So if you want to form a band, you'll kind of have to drive it yourself, really. In terms of marketing and profile, so the first thing I'd say is just as much as possible, when you're ready, get the chance to do something live, whether that's a school lunchtime concert, part of the end of term concert, it's a Saturday morning thing, busking in town. Sounds all quite traditional, but it really, really helps develop your presence. And with that, your social media presence. Obviously, an account for the band, tagging in the right organisations, perhaps starting locally, and then maybe tagging in some other organisations like Youth Music as well. And everyone's talking about, and of course, absolutely get it, the power of social media. But there is a bit of a shift towards actually the kind of local scenes and local involvement and local music scenes that young artists are developing themselves, like local communities of creativity. So what I mean by that is don't just rely on social media to do this, because there's so many other people wanting to do the same. And I suppose the last thing, which sounds really, really obvious, but ultimately it'll come down to writing great songs and writing some catchy hooks and writing a great chorus. And ultimately, I still believe that is like massively important. And the craft of writing a good song in a great band is going to be really important too. So your sound and your personal sort of take and vision really cuts through. And then what happens? People start to follow you. So I see social media as a tool, but actually you've got to get the craft right. So spend time in that like garage or rehearsal room, getting your sound right before you go out.
Definitely. And for our final question then is what makes a successful musician from Grey Court School?
Sorry, say that bit again.
So it's come from Grey Court School,
Yeah.
and it's what makes a successful musician.
Okay. So I'd say there's three things to think about. There's your music bit, your personal bit, and your social bit. So the music bit, as I mentioned at the start, be really good at something. So you develop a craft that's kind of matches who you are. There is lots and lots of competition. So to be a drummer and to be a session player, you have to be pretty good. Sounds a really obvious thing to say. So spend time and be patient and work with the right people to make you really good at something, you know, the craft thing. I think the personal thing is, you know, and not all musicians are like this. There are a lot of musicians with huge egos and high maintenance. I've worked with some of them, you know, it's hard work and it's all about them. But generally, if you want to make some kind of living, particularly if you're kind of doing it in this DIY thing, be really good at working with others, you know, really good. So it's not saying compromise and just like lying down and taking what anybody says to you, but actually just the ability to work well with others in the band, in a venue, in a school music department. I think you can never underestimate that. And if you're going to be employed, that's what employers want to see. I think the social thing, and for me, this has been the theme throughout. It's this kind of social justice element of music. So how music makes a difference in people's lives, and I suppose that's, for want of a better word, is the brand that I've developed because I'm really passionate about it. How you can use music as a tool to help change people's lives. And for me, that's like massively important. And even though I'm not a drummer now and I'm a CEO, that's the theme. So I think the social thing is, particularly in these times in the world, like wanting to make a social difference, make the world a better place, make young people's lives better. I think we should all be part of that because, you know, sometimes it's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. And for me, it's the current and next generation.
Great, thank you for answering that one. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our students with before we close today's session?
No, just to say thank you for joining. I hope that was helpful. Do have a look at youthmusic.org.uk. I'm on socials as well, at Matt Griff 1968, if you want to see some of the things I'm talking about. But yeah, that's, you know, that's hopefully things that will be helpful. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Speakers for Schools. I think just in terms of closing, you know, I talked about the music industry being a bit mystical. And I think there's some stakeholders and some people in power that deliberately make it mystical so that others can't cut through. And actually, what I'd say is it's not that mystical. The industry needs to get better at explaining how it works, and that's where Youth Music's really here to help. And we're happy to help anybody on this call if you wanted to look at the site. But I think finding out this information and you can make a living in this, but it'll probably be a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of everything. And certainly from my point of view, it's never been about fame. You know, I've done some nice things, but it wasn't because it was a platform that made me famous. It was just because I'm a musician, if you see what I mean. So I think that's about approach. So be, you know, modesty and humility, I think, can work every day of the week if you're going to be working with people.
Certainly. What a nice thing to kind of think about as we end today's session. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's been really great